Stephen will kick off this panel by talking about the renewable nuclear divide, and then Anne-Sophie will ask whether Europe has ever actually mattered at all in the fight against climate change. So Stephen, over to you.
All right. Thank you all for coming out on a wet Saturday. Only the brave and foolhardy come on a Saturday, so it's good to see everybody here. And I am going to be talking about European energy policy from the standpoint of a historian who's written about energy policy, but I'm talking about what's going on today. And this isn't really from any particular project, it's kind of growing out of my background interest. And I'm talking about the EU, and then I presume the next panelist will perhaps say how the EU really doesn't matter at all, and what this whole panel and discussion should have been about China and India. But maybe that's not where you're going to go. So to the extent that Europe matters, since the early 1990s, the European community, as it was then called, has tried to stake out a very clear global lead in the fight against climate change, and Brussels has seen this as a way to kind of project normative or soft power around the world. And you see this at the very earliest kind of climate conferences in 1989. In the Netherlands, at The Hague and Noordwijk, where European leaders tried to stake out ideas of setting binding carbon emissions targets. And they've repeated this at the Rio Earth Conference in '92, in Kyoto and at Copenhagen. And the EU, has Brussels in particular has tried to guide the nation states of Europe by setting targets. And you can see this in like the 2007 20-20-20 goals of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 20%, increasing energy efficiency by 20%, and achieving 20% renewables. So these are targets that Brussels lays out that the nation states in some ways have to hit. But there has been, in some ways, a marked failure of European-wide climate policy up until the Green New Deal, that in the 1990s, the big climate policy was going to be an energy tax that was rolled out in 1992 on the eve of Rio. That failed. In the 2000s, the big push was for an emissions trading system at the European level, but the price of carbon remained so low up until about 2020 or 2021 that it did very little to actually reduce carbon emissions. And so in some ways, the kind of ability of Europe to reduce its carbon footprint has relied very much on the nation states of Europe. And that energy policy has remained very much a national level affair. The EU has intervened with liberalization and other efforts, but there's still a lot of divergence in how national policy is made. And I'm going to focus today on so here's the goal setting. The green pathway is what Europe is trying to achieve by 2030, and so there's still a long way to go, right? And so I'm going to be focusing on the power sector, the energy electricity sector, which accounts for about a quarter of total emissions, right? So this is a big chunk. It's not everything. Transportation is obviously a big chunk. But the electricity industry is more important, I think, than this %, or this quarter lets on, insofar as there's plans to electrify everything, right? And so expanding electricity use and electrifying industry, electrifying transportation, is a key part of achieving climate goals. And so how and whether we electrify hinges on the extent to which Europe and other states can decarbonize their electricity sector. And here there are two main national level strategies that have emerged that in some ways are epitomized by France and by Germany. And this is by no means the only rift in kind of European level energy policy, but this is one of the main rifts between a French kind of approach epitomized by nuclear energy and the German approach epitomized by solar and wind and renewables. Now, there are many Eastern European nations that are in the nuclear camp: Hungary, Slovakia, Czechia, Finland. Belgium also has a large nuclear sector. Overall, nuclear supplies around a quarter of European electricity, and I'll talk a little bit later about how there are plans to ramp this up in various countries. The renewable camp is composed of Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. And this rift between renewables and nuclear in some ways dates back to the 1970s. And I'm happy to discuss this more in the Q&A. I didn't want to give kind of a backwards historical looking talk, but these differences between kind of a renewable and a nuclear pathway hinge on the relative influence of green parties in European states. They hinge on whether the left of center parties embraced or rejected nuclear power. The German Social Democrats, for example, had a very big wing that rejected nuclear power at a very early phase. They hinge on the power of utilities. Electricité de France, EDF, is like a state within a state, hugely influential, very different from the German system. And they also hinge on questions of ideology and about how nuclear was tied to questions of grandeur and prestige and kind of a third way or a third power in the case of France, or linked to threats to democracy and the fear of a revival of dictatorship in the case of Germany. These rifts exploded in 2022 and 2023 after the Russian invasion of Ukraine during an intense debate about whether to label nuclear power as a green energy and whether natural gas should be labeled a green energy or not. And whether or not by labeling nuclear green, it would be open to receiving subsidies from Brussels and subsidies on a fairly large scale. This kind of debate accelerated then as well as Germany began to phase out the last 6 and then the final 3 of its nuclear reactors. And there was really a visceral discussion on kind of nuclear power in Germany. I follow this in the news, I follow it on social media, and there's some really kind of nasty stuff and really strong opinions about Germany's decision to get out of nuclear. The pro-nuclear lobby saw Berlin's decision by the Traffic Light Coalition to get out of nuclear and to wind down these 3 reactors as a self-imposed wound, as something that was going to accelerate German deindustrialization and something that wouldn't help the climate agenda at all. And this was obviously made even more intense in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where natural gas became geopolitically radioactive, and there was a big push to try and get out of gas. The most recent debate kind of unfolded over what's called contracts for difference. And here I'm going to talk a little bit about the nitty-gritty. This was in the context of an energy crisis that rippled through Europe, in which Brussels was trying to find a way to navigate the very volatile price of electricity. And this gives you a sense of kind of how natural gas and power prices, rose dramatically and then came back down. But there was a lot of volatility fluctuating all over the place. And this idea of the contract for difference was when market prices for electricity are above production prices, that producers would have to pass on some of the difference to the state, and then the state would use those funds to relieve consumers and to bail out consumers. If market prices were lower than the production price of energy, then the state would compensate those producers. So there was a big debate where the Germans and the Dutch did not want French nuclear to be included in these contracts for difference. And they were afraid that France would get big windfalls by applying this to their cheap nuclear fuel. And then they would redistribute these windfalls, state subsidies to help out their own industry. So this is an example of kind of an intra-European rift over the allocation of state funds. France, by contrast, argued that the EU benefits from its cheap and its clean atomic powered energy. And France eventually basically won the debate. Nuclear has been included in contracts for difference. And Macron and others have heralded this as a key step for the EU in achieving its climate goals. French leaders now speak of a nuclear renaissance that's on the cusp of happening. At the recent COP28 in Dubai, Macron triumphantly declared that nuclear energy is back. And he led a group of 20 other countries signing a pledge to triple nuclear energy by 2050. France has plans to build, I think, between 6 and 8 reactors. There are visions of building up to 14 potentially. Other reactors are planned in Eastern Europe and in Scandinavia. And in looking at nuclear technology, advocates of nuclear power point out how France has decarbonized its economy since a big push into the nuclear sector in the 1970s. In the early 1970s, France produced about 70% of its power using fossil fuels. By the 1990s, that was down to 10%, right? So the grid became mostly nuclear power. And since 2022, because of changes in the German market, Germany actually began importing a lot of French surplus power, and I'll talk about why this is the case. So French advocates argue that their kind of nuclear anchor is key not only for decarbonization, but key for enabling a country like Germany and others to go into the shift to renewables. They argue as well that nuclear power is geopolitically secure, right? This argument has kind of regained purchase after 2022, and this is in the context of Pierre's idea of war ecology from yesterday. And nuclear advocates finally argue that small modular reactors, or SMRs, will be the wave of the future, that nuclear will let the EU keep its technological edge and be a key export sector in an increasingly kind of competitive world economy where exports are important. And yet, as you all know, I mean, nuclear has its own massive problems that we've known for a long time and that were revealed or underscored or highlighted again in 2022. And most dramatically, it's the extent to which nuclear power is a water-based technology. Per Högzelius, a Swedish historian, is writing a book about this, about how that nuclear is entrenched in water systems, super reliant on water systems. And we saw this with kind of this crazy intersection of climate change with the energy sector, where the droughts in France and in Europe in 2022 meant that the French power sector, the nuclear sector, had to ramp down production because there wasn't enough water for cooling. This kind of overlapped onto a series of scheduled reactors going offline because they had found cracks in the emergency cooling system in the most recently constructed reactors, heat stress cracks, and so they had to shut down 4 of the newest French reactors to get them back online. Nuclear advocates also sidestep the extent to which Russia is still a key player in the nuclear field, right? That there's Russia through Rosatom is one of the main suppliers of uranium. And it's one of the main suppliers of nuclear technology. France is less connected to Russian technology, but there still are connections. They send some of their fissile material to a Siberian plant to be reprocessed. And France buys, much of its uranium from Niger through a state-controlled French company that owns mines there. But they also buy uranium from Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan via Rosatom. Eastern European states, though, are much more kind of connected to the old Soviet models. They operate these Soviet water energy reactors that require a very specific type of fuel that's only refined in Russia now. So of the 19 reactors in Eastern Europe, 15 are of these water models, the VVER models. And so it's not surprising that, in the kind of sanctions and the energy sanctions after 2022, nuclear has been left off entirely. Rosatom has basically been immune from sanctions. Europe spent 750 million euros last year on Russian nuclear fuel elements, just to give an example. And then, of course, there's the big question of long-term storage for this carbon-free or nearly carbon-free source of energy. Finland, I don't know much about it, and I'm happy to talk more in the Q&A, but Finland is on the cusp of burying spent nuclear fuel in the world's first geological tomb. It'll be stored there for 100,000 years, right? So this is kind of the first kind of example of a country coming up with a long-term storage solution, but no other country really has this in place. But really, what I wanted to kind of focus on is in terms of meeting the climate challenge and Macron's plans for a nuclear renaissance, that nuclear plants have proved to be enormously expensive to build, and they take incredible amounts of time to produce. And the Hinkley Point C reactor in Great Britain is the best example of this. Planning started back in 2008. Construction began in 2018, and it's not estimated that it's going to finish until 2029 at the earliest, maybe 2031 or later. The costs have more than doubled. Now they've risen to between 25 and 26 billion pounds, but there are estimates that it might go higher, up to 31 billion pounds. And this is, this is actually produced or being built by EDF, the French company, and they had predicted that the United Kingdom would be cooking Christmas turkeys with power from Hinkley C by 2017. Right, that was 7 years ago. And there's this cost explosion, right? So there actually, the initial costs were 18 billion pounds. Now it's up to 25 to 30. People fear that it might be up into the 40s. Flamanville in Normandy is another example. This is a European pressurized reactor, again, designed and rolled out in 2007 with ideas. Engineers promised it would be up and running by 2012 at a cost of 3.3 billion euros. Now the final bill has increased up to 19 billion euros, right? So this is more than a quadrupling. And so the idea that nuclear, new nuclear could help meet climate targets anytime before like the mid 2030s is basically absurd, right? It's just not going to happen. Germany, though, has made another, has another pathway of renewables and energy. And this has also proven to be a very problematic gamble. There are a lot of problems with this. Germany, has decarbonized its economy as well to a certain extent. I mean, these are, one can look at carbon emissions trading as well, or sorry, embodied carbon trade as well. It gives a slightly different picture, but both Germany and France have decarbonized. And so on the one hand, it looks like Germany is doing well, or as well as France, but the power sector tells actually a very different story. If you look at the German power sector, it can vary immensely month by month, and you can watch kind of the change in the carbon intensity. There's a website that tracks this, and this, they track the carbon intensity of the power sector. Green is good, meaning low carbon. Brown or black is bad, meaning a lot of carbon. And the German problems with renewables stem from the inherent fact that renewables are intermittent, right? The idea that the sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. And you can see the Germany kind of flip-flopping back between having a light green kind of carbon imprint for its power sector to being more like Poland, because it has to rely so much on lignite coal or natural gas when you have these kind of cloudy days without a lot of wind. France, normally comes out looking pretty good here. And so this means that even though renewables have expanded a lot, if you look back here, you see that there has been a dramatic surge in renewables, and this surge is continuing, and I'll talk about this. That there are days or long stretches of time where Germany has to rely on coal plants or natural gas plants, or they import their power from neighbors like France. On the flip side, though, then there are moments when Germany is flooded with energy, where there's too much energy, and this creates these incredible problems. They have to, power prices go negative, right, which creates a problem for wind and solar producers. They have to export power to other countries' grids, to Poland, and they have to deal with that power somewhere. So the nature of this kind of intermittency is a real problem. And there are solutions to this. One of these is building more interconnectors between the grids of Europe. This has been a longstanding project since really the early 2000s. But there is, kind of other ways or other things that are happening, above all, kind of the expansion of batteries, which I'll get to. But before I talk about batteries, I just want to say that we are, in some sense, we stand in the middle of kind of a major technological industrial revolution. And this is one of the kind of the key facts that's emerged in the last 2 or 3 years, that solar power has seen its price drop dramatically, over the last 15 to 20 years. There's been this unbelievable price collapse in solar energy. This is due most recently to China and to Chinese manufacturing techniques. And so in some ways, solar power is a fundamentally different type of energy than fossil fuels or even the nuclear. That fossil fuel prices, in theory, rise as scarcity sets in. This isn't obvious if you look at the statistics. There's been a lot of fluctuation, but there's no kind of downward trend in fossil fuel prices over time. Nuclear energy prices have also tended to rise over time. South Korea is the exception, where you have seen some decline in nuclear power construction over time. But the opposite is true for solar. You've seen this kind of incredible learning curve, this incredible digression of costs, because the technology has improved. Solar prices have fallen by 99% in the past 30 years. And so solar is now the cheapest thing to build by far. And this is a novelty. And we can see this here. This is how kind of a history of International Energy Agency predictions of how much solar will be built. And you can see that solar, the yellow are the predictions and the black are the actual course of solar capacity construction. And you can see that solar production has, every year kind of categorically outstripped the IEA predictions. In Germany, solar expanded again after a lull in the mid to late 2010s under the late Angela Merkel years. Since 2022, Germany's passed new zoning laws that's made it easier to put up solar. This is kind of a blowback effect of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Over 14 new gigawatts of solar energy and 3.5 new gigawatts of wind have gone up. So that's basically enough to compensate for the loss of nuclear power. But again, getting back to the problem of intermittency, that is something that seems to be only getting worse if you just put up more and more solar. So there's the other technology of battery storage, lithium batteries. Increasingly now, there's research and development of sodium batteries. And this is, the other incredible development that paired with the price decline of solar is kind of contributing to this industrial technological revolution. That battery tech has improved immensely over the last 15 to 20 years. There's been a 90% decline in the price of lithium batteries, according to the IEA. And so the cost, this is comparable to kind of the improvements to the Model T back in the 1910s and the 1920s about how fast the pace of technological innovation is happening. And so this has the potential for kind of solving in the medium term some of these problems of intermittency. And so here an example is from the California grid, where California has been at the forefront of putting up solar and batteries. And you can see that this is kind of electricity usage over the course of a day. And the big yellow in the middle is solar that comes in the middle of the day. And the problem is, what do you do in the evening when you have everybody coming home from work? Electricity use actually increases between 4 o'clock and like 7 or 8 p.m. Just when the sun is setting. And so batteries are being built. And this green area here is all batteries that's basically been built over the last 2 to 3 years. And you can see just the immense rollout of batteries. And this is, we've heard a lot of pessimism, and there are reasons that batteries are bad. And I'm going to get at that in a couple minutes, or there are problems with battery construction. But this is that green area is kind of the key, right? If you can expand that, then you can make solar work on, a much kind of broader basis, and you kind of iron out some of these problems of intermittency. What is Europe doing with batteries? California, in some ways, is the leader, but Germany, again, because of new zoning laws, new subsidies, things that kind of kicked in after 2022, there's been a big growth in power storage capacity in Germany. Some of the big utilities are building batteries. Prussian Electra, which owned one of the recently decommissioned nuclear plants in Brockdorf, which was the scene of massive protests in 1976 and 1977. They have plans to turn this into a new battery storage site. But really, the real growth in Germany has been in individual or privately owned household level batteries, right? And this is getting back to the original idea of Germany's Energiewende, which is like a people's democracy, a local decentralized way to manage and handle an energy system. And so in Germany, there are 2 million households in the country that will have an energy storage system in addition to solar power by the end of the year. So this is kind of a very different development, where in California, it's these utility scale, like mega big battery parks. In Germany, it's much more of a household thing. But again, problems with batteries, where do the raw materials come from? We had, we heard this great talk this morning by Andre about, this solar battery revolution is not dematerialized, right? It's very much rooted in material needs, lithium, copper, aluminum, zinc. And there are major problems with where do you get lithium for batteries. There's a huge spike in the price of lithium in 2021 and 2022. It's come down some, but this is going to be a problem coming forward. The lithium supplies are dominated by Australia, Chile, Sub-Saharan Africa. Most of that is where kind of the raw lithium comes from, and then it's refined in China. China is kind of the hub of lithium refining and turning lithium into batteries. But the EU is trying to create its own lithium supply chain with the European Critical Raw Materials Act. And so this is a report that's kind of related. It's not from that Raw Materials Act, but it's derivative of that. And so I saw this, and it just made me think of your Africa plans from the 2040s and the 2050s, right? A very kind of neo-colonial aspect of here. We're going to use Africa as an extraction point to get lithium. So, nuclear has its uranium sourcing problems that Gabriela Hecht has really kind of underscored. Renewables have their own challenges, even in Europe itself. In the Jadar Valley in the west of Serbia, there are plans for a new massive underground lithium mine, which is owned by Rio Tinto. And so this has exploded over the last year or so in terms of becoming a major political debate. The local strongman, Alexander Vucic, wants EU money and wants Rio Tinto to invest, but local Serbians don't want this. They fear local environmental degradation. They fear what lithium mining is going to do to the water supply. China as well has actually invested in the Serbian economy, the Serbian mineral economy. There's Russian disinformation involved in trying to play up the problems with the mining and kind of highlight political divisions. So it's, and then you get these kind of historical legacies where Olaf Scholz, Chancellor of Germany, visits Belgrade, supports the idea of Rio Tinto opening this mine, but only elicits in Serbia kind of memories of German occupation and German mining projects in the 1930s and the 1940s. That's what my first book was actually about. So, and so there's these evocative images of kind of German imperialism or EU imperialism happening in Europe itself in the name of renewable energies. So, I don't think that this political debate will be solved anytime soon. I mean, these European cleavages are different, are deep, they're historical, and all these energies have problems. But it does seem that there is this kind of momentum behind the solar and the battery technology that's just, accelerating dramatically in terms of the amount of solar and battery that's being put up and in terms of the costs. And so it seems to me that grappling with the challenges of building an all renewable system is something that the EU, both the international and the domestic challenges, is something that the EU is going to have to grapple with going forward. So I'll stop there. I'll turn it over to you.
We have been talking about China or India all along.
Oh yeah, because the solar curve is China mostly.
Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you, Steven, for the great talk. So I'm not a scholar, I'm not writing a book, but I just spent 10 years working as a diplomat in multilateral climate negotiations. The first 5 years as a member of the French team that designed and negotiated the Paris Agreement, and the next 5 ones as the director of the UN Secretary General's climate team. And I want to thank Stefanos and the Remarque Institute for the invitation and I stopped doing that 6 months ago for, giving me the chance to reflect a little on my work, which was in fact a work, where you have to deal with frustration all the time. Frustration between, goals and actual practice, and frustration also very often about the European Union and the way the European Union handles climate negotiations. So a little word on the word relevance. This came to mind because, as you know, it's a very old trope in European history. I don't have to go back to Paul Valéry, the French philosopher, after the First World War, that Europe was actually just, the tip of the Asian peninsula, and maybe one day we'd get out of it. And it's a trope that is coming back these days in Europe, and you have mentioned that yesterday. For example, Mario Draghi, former Italian Prime Minister and former head of the European Central Bank, just published a report at the request of the European Commission that is titled "The Future of EU Competitiveness." And basically, it is about Europe economic relevance, very much in the fields that you talked about. And basically, he started his press conference by saying Europe faces a choice between exit, paralysis, and integration. So it's, we always back into that story of relevance of Europe. At the origin of my personal frustration, but which is not very interesting, but the more general frustration about the way Europe is in climate negotiation, is the fact that, and it is an artificial, of course, is that you have two Europes basically existing in this field. You have Europe of the European Commission, the mix of supranational and national rules, experiment in sovereignty, in sharing sovereignty with very strong institutions and regulations. And then in these negotiations, you also have historical Europe, not only, the EU, but the UK also now, other European countries, Norway in particular, that very often align, but not always with the EU. You have, of course, my own country, with also always ask itself about its own relevance in the world, but that's another story. And basically countries that have historically a very dense network of relations because of colonialism mostly, with a number of countries. For France, Western Africa, the Caribbean, Spain, Latin America, et cetera, you see what I mean. And this dense web of relation that is, comes from a history of predation of pretty much everything, body, souls, resources, etc., still exist international relation. And it's very strange because it's a relation, it's a network that is of kind of cultural understanding, of understanding each other and completely misunderstanding each other at the same time and not sharing anymore, obviously, the same goals and the same aspiration, while at the same time, having some common vocabulary here or there that obviously is the kind of things that is very helpful when you negotiate in a multilateral setting. So this is what I try to look at while reflecting on these past 10 years, and I will start with first Europe, the Commission. And the Commission, of course, matters very much in the multilateral regime on climate because they are the ones that have the sole mandate to negotiate on behalf of the EU members. So that is a representative of the Commission with next to the Commission, sorry for getting bad, the representative of the presidency of the European Union that changes every 6 months, as you know, that negotiates in climate and also in biodiversity on the basis of a mandate, meaning a text that has been previously agreed by member states, by ministers, through negotiations between the different ministers, and is generally published as what we call in Europe, Council conclusions, meaning you have a text with the mandates, where the red line are not, written explicitly, but that you can understand very easily when you read the text if you have a little practice. And this mandate is public, which is very strange because the EU is the only big negotiator in multilateral negotiation whose mandate and therefore red lines and therefore objectives are made public, while other negotiators keep that obviously private and close to the chest. And in a way, this is one of the characteristics of the European Union is, what you see, what we want is pretty much what you get and what we are trying to get, which makes it extremely difficult when you negotiate. And as you know, negotiations sometimes, they don't follow the linear strategy that the EU imagines. You have to change sometimes after a week. You have, because of your alliances, you have to try something else. And then you have, when this happens at the climate conference in general, the EU Commission organizes emergency meetings in the middle of the night of ministers who are there or their representative to change the mandate in the middle of the night and adjust a couple of lines. I mean, it sounds wild, and it is wild in a way, but this is, again, this objective of building together an objective and of being very transparent as much as possible on why this needs to go. So this is the EU. It's pretty unique. It means also that the EU's negotiating partners know exactly where to press, where to push or not push, because it's all there on the table, which makes it complicated. A good example of an almost, and you mentioned that, transcription of what the EU wants and, and the way it is organized into international law was the Kyoto Protocol. And I was not there at the time yet. It's a protocol that was negotiated between 93 and 97. As some of you, I'm sure, know, this protocol was meant to be an addition to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the main convention, and it is to discuss the implementation of this convention that countries meet every year at what is called the infamous now Conference of Parties, or COPs. And the Kyoto Protocol, what came out of it is very interesting because it really, to me at least, reproduces completely what the EU is about. What is it exactly? It is about, setting binding targets of emission reductions with numbers, and only for developed countries. And why only for developed countries? Because in the 1990s, still, there was no real discussion about the fact that developed countries, industrial countries, did have a big responsibility in climate change. And this is basically what we've been discussing for 1 day and a half. Yes, fossil fuels started the climate change crisis. And when you look at data that are now retrieved from ice cores, etc., you can see that the beginning of the concentration of gases started at the end of the 18th century, which is why Crutzen, when he coined the expression Anthropocene and started the whole discussion of does it exist, does it not exist, etc., etc. But one thing he said was this Anthropocene era probably started around the same time that James Watt invented the steam engine, meaning at the end of the 18th century, really pointing out to, again, the responsibility of these countries. And this language exists in climate negotiations. We talk about historical emissions in the atmosphere today, and scientists now are able to calculate which country is responsible for the most historical emissions, meaning the accumulation of emissions in the hemisphere. Surprise, the United States has emitted more carbon than any other country to date and is responsible for about 25% of carbon emissions. Then you have the European Union and United Kingdom, about 20%, so pretty much the same. Meanwhile, when you look at China and other countries, their historical emissions obviously are much lower. 10% for China, 3% for India, even less for Brazil, etc., meaning that clearly the responsibility is there in the atmosphere, so to speak. Obviously, this ranking of historical emissions is not the one that is now currently discussed when you negotiate. We look now only at current emissions, meaning that China is the most emitting, followed by the US, followed by the EU, which in itself, is something now that has become a problem. But back in 1990, back around the negotiation of Kyoto, historical emissions were recognized more or less as, in fact, representative of the way each country should take responsibility, and I'll get to that. When the negotiation started for the protocol of Kyoto, Europe felt that it was, in a pretty good position. They were ready to agree to binding reduction targets. They were ready to recognize the fact that we needed a mechanism of verification of compliance. And in fact, the parameters of the negotiation were very aligned with the way, again, the EU functioned. I don't want to overemphasize, but you see what I mean. A lot of top-down regulations, verification, and a sharing of the burden between the different countries. Crucially, at the time, these parameters were also pretty much the ones of the United States. And at the end of the day, it was mostly a negotiation between the European Union and the United States that led to the agreement in 1997. Just a reminder, at the time, the United States had someone named Al Gore as a vice president who was, convinced and had been working on these issues for a while and was really instrumental in defending the need for the US to be part of what was then considered as an ambitious agreement. And in reality, the US were negotiating for that group of negotiation where you had Japan, Australia, and Russia also. Those were the days. So adopted in 1997, just very quickly, the Kyoto Protocol said that countries should reduce emissions by an average of 5% against 1990 levels over a period of 4 years. And the idea was to renew every 4 years the targets. The only countries that had to do that were developed countries. So this protocol was really, in reality, for the European Union, the United States, and each one had a percentage that they had to reduce. European Union, 8%, US, 7%, et cetera, et cetera. And it's also in this protocol that were agreed the market measures that you discussed, the ETS, the carbon markets, et cetera, as part of, measure meant to help countries to implement their commitment. So the Europeans were very happy. Kyoto was really a political success for them. The demonstration that climate change could be combated through regulated collective action, market instruments, binding national commitments, etc. And it also demonstrated that the EU could hold its own against the United States. I mean, it was not, they were not really adversarial, but they managed to get what they wanted. And in a way, the protocol, even if it lasted very little, but kind of jump-started, the decrease more or less of emissions in the EU, where emissions tend to decrease, except for transportation, which are still going up. But it's part of a larger story that we also discussed yesterday. Then everything collapsed. The protocol failed miserably. And why? Because the United States decided, as you know, not to ratify the protocol and not implement it. That came in 2000. President Bush had just been elected by Fred, and I don't want to create PTSD among the American audience in this group, but and basically it withdrew the United States by saying, this is very nice that we industrial countries, take our part, but there's no reason why the countries that are high emitters now do not contribute to the reductions of emission, meaning obviously China. And it's really at the pivot, of the end of the 90s and early 2000 that a little less for Europe, but very clearly for the United States, the field of climate negotiations became mostly a field of competition, of managed competition, let's say, with China. And that was also in the background, and I was thinking about that during the panel just before this one. It had a lot to do also, and it still is the case, with what the first President Bush said in the early 90s, meaning the US way of life is not negotiable. And in many ways, we are still very much in this kind of mindset. So the US left, very few years later, Canada left, and basically the whole construct, rational, rule-based construct completely collapsed. And with that, the Kyoto Protocol. So that was in the mid-2000s. I started working in 2009, avoided the catastrophe that was the Copenhagen conference, and really started working at the moment where countries had decided to rebuild climate negotiation and make sure that, and give it another try in a way, is there a possibility of collective action to fight climate change? And this is what led to the Paris Agreement. And there, and again, I'm being a little crude, but it's just for the sake of the presentation mostly. Europe, in the negotiation for the Paris Agreement and the years that came later, really relied more on its historical Europe identity. Because there were some lessons learned from Kyoto. First lesson, any climate agreement needs to be universal. It's useless not to have everyone. Second lesson, it's going to be impossible to have top-down targets with numbers because the US will not accept it unless China does the same, which will not happen for a reason I will get to. Third point, this agreement also had to be beneficial for least developed countries, islands, and in general, what we call vulnerable countries, countries that are really feeling the impact of climate change that needed to get something out of it. And that's the discussion you alluded to that on loss and damage. So actually, there is something in international law that allows for this, recognition of responsibilities. This is called CBDR RC. It's a principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capacities, which is a principle that is embedded in international law since 1992, since the Rio Conference. It's the same Rio Conference that also produced the polluter-payer principle that I am sure you know. What does this principle say? That the developed countries acknowledge the responsibility that they bear in the international pursuit of sustainable development in view of the pressure their societies place on the global environment and of the technologies and financial resources they command. So in international law, CBDR really describe the shared obligations of different countries and also recognize that if there is a collective response, it is not the same for countries and the different levels of contribution, meaning the history, should be recognized. And the other great principle that is thankfully becoming more and more important in these negotiations is the principle of equity, which comes from even before. And again, I'm going fast, but I think one of the main and first proponents of this principle in equity in international law was India, which is still very much a champion. And I'm sure you've heard of the famous and very often quoted speech by Indira Gandhi at the Stockholm 1972 conference, where she said, "Are not poverty and need the greatest polluters?" And so that's how this issue of equity fighting against poverty, little by little, got its way into the Rio Conference and then into the 3 conventions that were signed in Rio. In each convention, and in particular the Climate Convention, you have an annex. And in the jargon of negotiators, Annex 1 is the annex with a list of developed countries. These are the countries that have the most obligation. These are the ones that owe to act. So what was Europe's role in Paris? And I'm judge and party, so I will not insist, but what Europe was able to do was really to play a role of what we call a bridge builder between different meaning Europe used its networks, its relation, in particular with island countries, African countries, Caribbean, to build a coalition. And to build a coalition to defend a number of things, in particular, making sure that in the Paris Agreement, yes, mitigation measures would be important, meaning emission cut, but also adaptation. Make sure that adaptation, which is very important for developing countries, because again, they are the ones who need to adapt now, and loss and damage. And just very briefly on loss and damage and why it was so important. Loss and damage has been a very live, contentious issue in the UN negotiations for, ever. There is no legal definition or official definition of loss and damage at the United Nations for a reason. It's still a general term that is used to refer to the consequences of climate change that go beyond what people can adapt to. For example, it's the loss of coastal sites, because of the rising sea levels. It's the loss of homes, something there is nothing, to adapt to. This idea of loss and damage has been historically defended by island countries because they are the ones, that are, really in the existential position of having to survive. And they are the ones that about 30 years ago proposed to create a scheme to, in fact, compensate them against loss and damage. And this is why, and you can see why, things became tricky. Vanuatu, on behalf of the Alliance of Small Island States, proposed in 1991 to create an insurance scheme to provide financial resources to countries impacted by sea level rise. Under this proposal, each country would contribute funds based on their historical emission. And this would go to the islands. And this proposal met with fierce opposition from developed countries because they felt that compensating for loss and damage on the basis of historical emissions would be construed as an admission of legal liability, triggering litigation and compensation claims on a huge scale. So the proposal was rejected in 91. The issue of loss and damage disappeared for a while and came back during the negotiation for the Paris Agreement. And basically, since one of the objectives of the Paris Agreement was to have a universal agreement with everyone, that gave a big leverage to islands. They said, if you want us to sign and to be part of this, we want this. This is what we want. We want an article on loss and damage, and we want as much as we can get on the issue. And they got it because the Europeans were the first ones to break with other industrial and developed countries, in particular the US, to agree that and as us, the French presidency, you have a little leeway in negotiating to help them get that. And basically, it so happens that I was the one to do that. I put in a room island negotiator and US negotiators, closed the door and said, you get out when you have found something. I did bring them some water. So they managed to find a deal, and mostly because this went at the highest level. Someone went to Obama's, telling him, supposedly you're an island boy, you're from Hawaii, so you have to, help them. They found an agreement, but they found an agreement that was not. Sorry, well, I finished. You can see that I'm not a professional. The article on loss and damage exists in the Paris Agreement, but does not mention any liability. The article says And there is also an explanation in the COP decision that this article does not involve or provide a basis for any liability or compensation. This is what the US asked for and got in exchange for accepting on loss and damage in the Paris Agreement. But the islands did not stop there, and I will finish with that, with the story of victory. Islands continue to push to get more on loss and damage with the help of the European Union, but mostly, and this is the big difference between Kyoto time and Paris time, the help of a big coalition of NGOs, civil society, mostly that really organized on behalf of the islands and vulnerable country, a big campaign. And 2019 and you know, Greta Thunberg, etc., were very much part of that campaign to make sure that there will be something tangible coming on loss and damage. And this happened another COP in 2022. The issue of a fund for loss and damage, the one you were mentioning, was put on the table. All the developed countries blocked until the last moment, until again, Europe decided to break with the US, and I can still hear the screams of the US, of John Kerry actually, screaming at the European, at Timmermans, saying, you know, how could you do that, you know, et cetera, et cetera. The fund was agreed, the fund was funded, but as I told you, this is still not a fund for reparations, for compensation, etc. So it is being funded now. It is objectively a victory for islands and other countries, because 10 years ago it was impossible even to imagine that this would come. The money is very limited. Yes, it is not grants, it is loan, it is not enough, etc. But if you are, like I am, you know, a negotiation, multilateral, you know, discussion, every victory is a victory, and you know, you move forward, and I'm sure because islands and their allies have been very active and are continuing to work on the subject. Now they are moving to international courts to get to litigation actually on loss and damage. I'm sure we will see more of that. Just to finish, I wanted to say that I really hope and Europe will continue to play this role, will not be constantly aligned with the US in particular in international negotiations, will continue to engage and to be responsive to the needs of you know, all the other countries that are left completely out, by the way, of the renewable energy race, that are being attacked on critical minerals. And this is really an historical choice with this new commission that what happens. We'll have to make. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay, on that cautiously optimistic note, let's throw it open to questions, and let's take 3 at a time, maybe. Yeah, Yuri, and then and the third one. Good, then let's take those 2 first.
Thank you very much for the panelists. My question is for Professor Gross, and I was wondering if you could go a little bit more into decarbonization in Germany after the Ukrainian invasion of Ukraine. Specifically, you mentioned a lot about how renewables are going. The sector affects consumers, but it's my understanding that renewables are at this point largely not applicable to industry. German industry still relies on oil and gas and byproducts like lubricants, and this has been a question of some political valence there. So I was wondering if you could speak
on that. So yeah, again, questions directed itself, and I was thinking about how different energy systems imply different forms of social formation. So like one of the critiques of nuclear power is that it begs and requires a security state in terms of like protecting that infrastructure from attack, etc. So it implies certain forms of social formation. And like for the renewables, you see these pictures about all these ideas where we've all got electric cars and we've got solar panels. We all become sort of like mini capitalists and mini traders of energy, etc. So I just wondered if you could reflect and speak a bit more to what extent that does shape the debate? Do you see that shaping the debate or not? And any reflections, that aspect of it?
Yeah, I mean, let me tackle this question first. I think that, you know, this idea that techno systems have different social implications is something that's been around for a while. And it was really important in how I think the Germans came to embrace, or how certain parties in Germany came to embrace renewables in the 1970s and 1980s, because nuclear power was linked to kind of big scale technology, fears of a resurgence of authoritarianism. And, you know, they drew from Amory Lovin's, the 1976 Soft Path article in Foreign Affairs, and they actually just kind of imported those ideas directly and said we have local decentralized energy systems that are possible that will make for a thriving democracy. That was a big part of the argument, and embraced by both the Greens and the Social Democrats, and even a reform wing of the Christian Democrats. And I think that logic and those arguments were certainly at play in kind of the groundbreaking legislation around 2000 when Germany embarked on its Energiewende. But then what happened was in the 2000s, and here it gets into policy nitty gritty, that the way public money was given out to support renewables changed, and that favored kind of larger groups that pooled capital, and you have kind of financial companies getting involved, and you see kind of a shift over from the people's energy democracy to a much more corporate organized energy system. Even solar farms, offshore wind farms, these things take a lot of capital. And in the 2010s, there was both kind of a slowdown in growth in renewables in Germany, but also a shift to who was actually building them. It's like kind of collections of investors who were investing in both solar and wind. And that's, I think, you know, changing again a little bit after 2022 in the sense that like you know, one of the pieces of legislation, I don't know if it's legislation or kind of executive orders that came out was kind of loosening zoning restrictions around building stuff. And so that made it easier again to build renewables on a smaller scale, both wind and solar in Germany. And that was directly a response to kind of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the shift to kind of reanimate the Energiewende in the context of security, right? In terms of decarbonization, I mean, this industry, I mean, I think that's the real challenge right now that I focused my talk on the power sector. And there are certain, you know, there's types of industry that can use electricity. And so if you can electrify things, then that's going to help, you know, industry as well as households. But then there are other industries, the chemical industry in particular with BASF and others, that are heavily reliant on, you know, chemicals as an input and petroleum as an input. And so that's something that, you know, I can't really speak to on a technological level, but that's a different type of transition that's required than kind of the power sector or even the automobile sector where you can electrify, and people are trying to electrify, but with, you know, petrochemicals, it's like one of the, you know, the chart we saw about the green or the earthly limits with those different quadrants that was shown, and climate change in some ways seems more solvable than like kind of the petrochemical processes, which we become so reliant on. Plastics are ubiquitous, right? And that I think is more challenging for sure. And it's particularly hard for Germany because they have such a large petrochemical industry that uses a lot of energy, but it uses a lot of other inputs as well. And so that's been one of the industries that's been most affected after 2022. I think that's a harder problem actually to solve theoretically. I mean, my knowledge is a little bit limited than the energy.
No, you're right. And steel and cement, where there is still no process not to.
I think Sophie had one, and then.
Kent, I have a question to each of you. So, Anne-Sophie, yeah, thank you very much for taking us backstage with the negotiation and really bringing to light how the risks and the discussions are formulated and sometimes in screams and shouts. And so going back to what dominated probably yesterday's discussions about the corporate capitalist networks actors imbricated in the military sector, in the security sector and all that. How do these actors appear and express themselves at this, let's say, actors and network level? Do they appear directly in Kyoto and Paris in the summits? I imagine they're very much in the background through lobbyist networks and all that. But could you, I guess you have this unique knowledge of how it's actually done. And Stefan, I have a question about the nuclear sector and how it's been rethought, and also this rift between France and Germany, that in France, in this repopularization of nuclear energy, in parallel, there were all these questions about governance. I think Macron changed the system of governance in the nuclear sector. I think, I'm not sure, but I think it was about the level of secrecy and confidentiality, that certain information was not to be publicized anymore for safety reasons, but all that. Have there been changes in light of this reset, let's say, over the past, since the 2000s, in governance thoughts and reflection in Germany and in France?
Let's take two more questions.
Just a question on this North-South question that the last panel was about. In Europe, in a unique position for you, is in a unique position of being a large trading partner with so many countries, a unique position in having shareholder power in the IMF, in the World Bank, in multilateral institutions. So those seem to be, trade and finance seem to be two very large zones where Europe does have a lot of power, and in fact is unwilling to change the shareholder quotas in the Bretton Woods reform negotiations that have been happening. Is that just a question for you, is that a more fruitful place to think about the energy transition and climate negotiations and justice between North and the South in the zone of trade? Going back to what Andres was talking about, questions about local value addition, technology transfer, questions about balancing European domestic relocation needs. That's a fruitful negotiation, right? You can't have all there and all here. That's a zone of negotiation. And Europe also has all of these large multinational trading companies that are, why Ivory Coast or Ghanaian chocolate farmers never get to have, a cent of the chocolate bar that's sold for 10 euros. So is that the right place that we should be thinking about these negotiations instead of the zone of COP meetings once a year?
So very briefly, I don't know if in the context of Paris Agreement and subsequent meetings, there have been a possibility to habilitate or allow for SDRs to be part of green finance or climate finance. And then for Stephen, related, I think 4 or 5 years ago, the EU launched public consultation on the use of the euro in the energy markets, and basically concluded that they don't want to get the US mad by proposing to use the euro for purchasing oil and gas and so forth, and they're sort of stuck to the dollar for the energy markets, and how that can or cannot have an implication in terms of Europe's strategic role.
Over to you.
So corporate interest, etc., and in particular fossil fuel interest, but not only, also big financial institutions. I don't call them lobbies anymore, because when you say lobby, you imagine, someone, 3 people sitting in a chair. They're everywhere. They're absolutely everywhere. They are part of delegations, because countries are the ones who negotiate. You can bring whoever you want in your delegation to a climate conference, and if you want to have, and actually you do, many countries do that for reasons that can be good also, and they have representatives of corporations. So they are inside in reality, and but they are also inside in the negotiations. And in a way, it should be an advantage for the EU because, you know, the different, you can, you know, they can use the power plays to really offset, you know, the importance of corporate and make sure that governments not always represent, you know, the big interests, but are the ones that negotiate looking beyond, you know, and we are not there, quite frankly. There is a lot to be done on that, and I'm talking with Pierre about that, you know, about the way not only the COPs are run, but the delegations are organized, reached a point. On the different spaces of negotiation, you know, at this point, there is such a huge pressure and so much backlash coming from the US, from China, from fossil fuel industry, for someone used the word dominant classes, you know, but huge against multilateralism, against the UN that by any means necessary. Let's not drop one space to anyone. Let's not abandon one space of negotiation to anyone. So COPs or event COPs, and yes, absolutely, the board meetings of the World Bank and the IMF, you know, are also now places for negotiation where Europe 100% of the time aligns with the US. I have no example in mind where European shareholders of the bank really broke recently with the US, except on the SDRs reallocation, where some European countries accepted to share their additional SDRs with some developing economies to use as guarantee for loans, etc. So that was kind of stories, but these are places that are not contested yet and should absolutely be contested. And yes, the SDR are part of the finance negotiation, even in COPs, where the finance negotiations are not only about public finance, but have also included how you know, private finance, SDRs, again, by any means necessary, can be part of the negotiation. And this is why what you alluded to, what Europe is currently doing to classify finance, you know, brown, green, etc., is so important. It's far from being perfect, but it should be used as a leverage tool.
Yeah, but both questions that I don't have very good answers to. But with the question about trading oil in dollars versus euros, I think one of the structural problems with shifting to euros is that there's historically no big futures market that deals with oil that's kind of anchored in the EU. So these coming out of the 70s oil crisis, where you had long-term kind of opaque contracts between producer states and the big oil companies. In the 80s, along with deregulation, neoliberalism, there's the rise of these kind of future markets in New York that is based on West Texas Intermediate, WTI, London based on Brent crude, which comes from the North Sea market, and then a little bit later, Dubai. And so those are the three big futures markets. And you know, those are not based in the EU. I mean, there's stuff around Rotterdam, but it's not as big. So I think that's part of like a structural problem, having like a futures market that's denominated in a particular currency that's also anchored to a spot market that trades a particular type of oil. You know, West Texas is like the US oil basis or futures market anchor, Brent crude for the North Sea, and Dubai kind of has the Gulf. And so I think without that anchor to a futures market that's based on a particular metric or benchmark, it's hard to have oil traded in a particular currency. So that's my stake that doesn't have to do with trade-offs, but you know more about the euro-dollar trade-off.
Not on euro, but what's actually happening within the BRICS, you know, this group of countries that recently welcome Saudi Arabia, and that they are trading, they have started to trade and to oil in particular and other fossil fuels in renminbi, in the Chinese, to create this kind, and it, you know, it's space to watch whether they'll be able to create, and this is certainly their intention, from the euro and dollars market, and to create this smaller internal market between the big consumers.
And then real quick with the push for more transparency, I can't talk about the French example. I just don't know enough, maybe some, but you know, in the German case, there's still incredible opacity about what was going on with nuclear power in 2021 and 2022 in terms of the costs involved, in terms of what the government was told by the utilities, in terms of what the utilities wanted, and about whether plants, once they were shut off, could be turned back on. And there was a big debate once the plants were shut off that the utilities, you know, had apparently said, oh, we can turn these back on, but the government wanted to move ahead and decommission them, you know, kind of permanently. So I think Germans, the Traffic Light Coalition, despite being composed of Reds and Greens, the Greens in particular, who had historically wanted a lot of transparency with the nuclear sector, that they weren't at all transparent with what was going on. And that's what got, I think people are really, you know, questioning some of the motives and the reasoning behind it. You know, there's polls, it came out in 2021 and 2022 that said that 2/3 of the German public actually wanted to keep the reactors on. And so like, and that was a big shift since like 2015, it would have been reversed, right? So that favorability of nuclear power had a pretty, you know, quick and remarkable turnaround. And I think that was related to the power of the climate movement that Andreas Malm was talking about yesterday, that there was a sense that climate was such a problem that even people who were, you know, antithetical to nuclear power thought that climate trumped kind of the fears that were associated with nuclear power. So, but I'm sorry, I don't have enough knowledge about the.
Okay, unfortunately, that's all we have time for because lunch is calling. But thank you for the questions and thank you to the panelists. So let's do it.